Hello everyone, Ashley here with Tolton Art. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be talking all about how to approach your artwork. If you are a consumer of any amount of artistic social media, I am sure that you have seen many different ways of how different artists start a painting. And so let's just kind of talk about some of the ways. I think if we were going to make this as generic as possible, I would say there are definitely two majority ways that people approach a painting. And one is kind of covering the whole canvas at once, working on it as a whole. And then there are those that work section by section. So how this looks in greater detail, covering the whole canvas would be a block and layer, and then kind of a modeling phase, and then a detail phase. Versus the other way, which is working in sections, where you kind of like finish one area before you move on to the next area of the painting. So in covering the whole canvas tends to be more of the people who have gone the academic art route versus those that work in sections. They can still come from an art program, but I've noticed they tend to be more in the realm of realism and hyper-realism. So let's kind of break down why each is the way that it is and why it might attract those different realms of artists. So for starters, art educators and art institutions tend to teach covering the whole canvas at once. Part of this is because it is the old masters technique. It is literally the tradition that has been passed down for centuries, and it is because it works, right? It's a tried and true method. It definitely has its pros and cons, which we'll talk about, but that does tend to be in the more academic realm. As I said, one thing that I've noticed with those that go in sections tend to lean more towards the kind of hyper-realistic, realistic realm of artwork. And I think the reason this happens is because it really allows you to break down the canvas in a very manageable way. If you're doing a detailed and accurate painting, it can sometimes feel incredibly overwhelming to tackle the whole thing at once. So by breaking it down into sections, allows you to make it very attainable and detail oriented. One of the pros for working the whole canvas at once is it tend to create a very seamless and cohesive piece of artwork. One of the cons of sectional painting is that it can be more difficult to identify color and value balance as a whole because you are only working in sections, so you're a little bit disconnected from what might be on the other side of the canvas. Not impossible by any means. It just takes kind of like careful preparation and awareness. I do think working in sections, one of the cons is that it can potentially lead to a more rigid painting versus working the whole canvas because it's all done at once, and it can be a little bit easier to get life and movement into paintings like that. Again, that's very much why old masters were doing it in this way, because it was very conducive for creating depth and movement and life in the artwork. If you're working sectionally, I think there's a way to do it and still attain those same goals, but I'll talk about that after and like my own approach on how I do paintings. So those are kind of the brief pros and cons for each type. There's definitely no right or wrong. There's just the different way that works for you. Sometimes it's a mixture of both. Sometimes it's one versus the other. It really just ends up being what feels right to you and what best helps you convey what you want to say in that piece of artwork. So this leads me into my own technique for painting. I used to do the cover the whole canvas at once. I personally found it really difficult. I tended to get so lost, so overwhelmed. It just, I don't know, something about it really doesn't click with my mind. And once I gave myself permission to start experimenting with sectionals again, it all clicked. So I definitely tend to do more of a sectional approach. However, the exact way that I do it can vary depending on each painting. I don't have one tried and true method of like, oh, I always start from the background and move forward. I don't do that. Sometimes I will start with the main subject first and then work kind of immediately what's around the subject at the same time. The reason I do this is because I'm taking in what I learned from covering the whole canvas at once and now applying it to maximize this sectional painting. And that is by putting a little bit of like the background with whatever you are painting. You can soften those edges really easily. And that was something that was really missing when I first moved towards painting sectionally. I would let it dry overnight and then I'd like paint the background up to the subject, or vice versa. I'd paint the background first and then I'd paint the subject like up to the line of the background. And it kind of just created hard lines everywhere. And because what was previously done was dry, it just like, it didn't blend, creating a very stamp-like quality to my artwork. So once I kind of problem solved this and realized that edges were the issue, I normally go for like the subject matter or some like object, and I will paint that how I want and then paint just like a really thin strip of the background around it and then soften those edges where I want it to be soft. And in that way, I am able to now get soft edges, create more depth, and work with fresh, wet paint. So it just like, it creates those beautiful halftones. But I paint enough of the background that I can kind of go in at a later time and color match and just like use a big brush and cover any background space. So my approach to painting is a little unspecific. It tends to be quite intuitive. Sometimes I work background to foreground. Sometimes I do the main subject first and what's immediately around it. And sometimes I just pick the section that I want to do and what calls me that day. Again, always doing a little bit of a section around it so I can blend that at a later date. Regardless, no single painting is done in the exact same method. However, I do spend a lot of time up front and before I start the painting, game planning how I want to tackle and how to best tackle the painting in the sense of like making sure that I am having crossovers at the right spot, that I'm covering canvas in the right way, that I can get those really soft disappearing edges. I'm definitely not going in blind. So with this approach of just kind of picking intuitively and doing a little bit around it and matching that together with the rest of the artwork, by the time my whole canvas is covered, it's basically all done. The only thing that I might add on at the very end is an additional few highlights somewhere, as well as potentially a few darker shadows. I'm recently gotten in the habit of painting in a smaller, condensed like value range, so I don't really hit the maximums, the darkest or the lightest. And then at the very end, I'll kind of decide, does this need pure white on it? And does this need, just like a little extra bit of dark? But I save kind of both of those tonal values for the very end. So while it can be more difficult to maintain this kind of color and value consistency across the whole page, I do honestly think I have had better luck with getting softer edges when I work in a section, and it's just because I can just focus on that area instead of getting lost on a grand scheme. And when that happens, if it dries, then you have to go back and repaint the whole thing, which is really annoying because sometimes my first layer down is my absolute favorite. And so I don't really want to keep taking away from that. That was another thing that I kept running into, was when I would do this like block in layer, I would honestly love the brush marks that I put down. But because I was so focused on covering canvas, I didn't spend enough time thinking about edges and value and all of these balancing things. And so I would have to go back, but it was dry. So then you're repainting the whole thing. And then the second time that I would paint it, it would just get more and more kind of rigid and disconnected from the initial feeling. There's something about working in a section that really just allows me to like dive into that section and really be like, what do I want this piece to convey? And it works for me to unpack it that way. Regardless of which method you choose, There is no right or wrong. You can mix and match any amount of it. It really just comes down to what feels right to you. And again, what allows you to convey the message in the artwork that you want. There are people that are doing both types of artwork that can create similar pieces. So covering the whole canvas, you can still get a very realistic painting, just as working in sections, you can still get a very impressionistic, cohesive body of work. It just really comes down to what feels right, how your brain works, and analyzing your artwork. You know, each method has its pros and cons, so learning the cons, taking these cons, and making it work for you. Things to keep in mind when you're picking which kind of style to do. One would be, how large is the canvas that you're painting on? It is easier to do an entire, like cover the entire canvas if it's smaller. I definitely ran into these issues when I was painting on large canvas. Again, just too much surface to cover, and it overwhelmed me. The next thing is, how detailed is your composition? If it is incredibly detailed, it might be easier to break it up into sections, because then you can really just analyze and focus on that instead of getting lost in the whole. And finally, of course, it's just, what's the overall look that you're going for? Do you want the more painterly effect of covering the whole canvas? Do you want kind of the more crisp, potentially higher level of detail in the sectional? It doesn't matter. There's really no wrong choice or wrong way to do it. It's just the end effect that you want. Either way, I hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much for joining today, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.